Easily one of the funniest big studio comedies of the 1990s, Bowfinger opened in theaters on this day, 1999.
And we're back, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I want to thank you all for spending some of your Tuesday morning here with me in New York. Once again, we're going to skip right on past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Today marks the 25th anniversary of the release, what I believe to be a top 10 best big studio comedies of the 1990s, a film boasting the talents of two of the comedy goats. Whether you want to talk from the perspective of stand-up comedy or film comedy, which is an entirely different art form, as we know. And somehow this movie is not as well remembered as the other great films that both of the gentlemen in the movie are most famous for. The film is Frank Oz's 1999 classic, Bowfinger, which stars Steve Martin and Eddie Murphy. Now, Steve Martin is a sort of unicorn where he is so talented. There are so many different things that he does, not just well, but spectacularly well. It's maybe difficult for younger people who only know him from Only Murders in This Building. He was a live wire. Even before Robin Williams was tearing up the stand-up stage with shit that no one had seen before, Steve Martin was doing different shit that no one had seen before. He was completely bonkers. Nothing like the kind of cute, safe, older guy in his mid to late 70s that you might think of him as today. He was a pioneering, trailblazing talent, as was his co-star in this film, Eddie Murphy. There's not only one way to be a groundbreaker, a pioneer, a trailblazer. There are numerous paths. And you think of Robin Williams as a stand-up, you think of Eddie Murphy with his early stand-up specials, and you think of the just insane shit that Steve Martin was pulling off on stage where the audience almost sounded, and you can watch the videos on YouTube, almost sound scared. Like, this is the kind of guy that might try to set fire to the theater. Like, he's fucking crazy. But Steve Martin was somebody who spent a lot of time working on specific projects throughout his career. So, for example, one of my favorites, also somewhat under the radar, the movie that he did called L.A. Story, which came out in what may have been his finest year in terms of achievement. In 1991, he had Grand Canyon, as good as any movie, including Silence of the Lambs from 1990, when he plays a dramatic role. Father of the Bride, big box office hit. It's a scream. L.A. Story, early in the year. 3 major studio releases, all very successful films, either artistically, critically, commercially, or, in the immortal words of Chevy Chase, answers D, all 3. In the case of that year, you can argue that all three boxes were checked for those films. But Steve Martin worked on the screenplay for L.A. Story for at least 7 years. This is somebody who may not necessarily be known as a perfectionist, but he is. And he worked on the screenplay for what became Bowfinger also for quite some time. Now, at that time, when the film was in the initial stages where Steve was, getting pieces together to make the film, he had done movies like Sergeant Bilko, which really wasn't very good. Father of the Bride Part 2, also not very good. Mixed Nuts from 94 had a lot of buzz about it, but it completely tanked at the box office. A Simple Twist of Fate, another attempt at drama, that didn't work. And Leap of Faith in 92, I thought was actually a really good movie, and that bombed with critics and audiences. So Steve, after this unbelievable period, from All of Me, opposite Lily Tomlin in 1984, through 1991, he was just knocking out one great movie after another. Almost unparalleled for somebody to have put out as many memorable film comedies almost consecutively. But Steve was preparing Bowfinger, and the studio wanted Keanu Reeves for, mild spoiler, what amounts to a dual role of the Ramsey brothers, Kit and Jiff. Now, the movie doesn't tell us this, hence why I said mild spoiler. They wanted Keanu, and I don't know if it was that Keanu was too busy. He made the movie Chain Reaction with Andrew Davis, a guy who had recently done The Fugitive. Keanu may have been preparing The Matrix. The first Matrix came out a couple of months before Bowfinger, but it didn't work out with Keanu. Also, Steve had apparently had a very good experience working with Keanu in Parenthood a number of years earlier, and he was eager to work with him again. So these are the things that happen in Hollywood. Sometimes a person is up for a role simply because, hey, I really like this guy. Can we get him? I consider him friend, whatever. So Eddie Murphy then expressed interest. And Eddie had, his career had really dipped in the late 80s into the 90s. And then The Nutty Professor in 96 was a huge comeback for him. The irony, though, is that the skill, the craftsmanship in Eddie's performances didn't dip. What dipped was the movies themselves and the audience's willingness to embrace Eddie in certain roles and performances. Because the way I see it, Boomerang is actually really good, underperformed at the box office. The Distinguished Gentleman, also very good, underperformed at the box office. I happen to think Vampire in Brooklyn is fantastic, underperformed at the box office. So sometimes it's just a matter of, are the audiences going to your movies? And then the perception is Eddie's career is on the downside. Think about how young he was. What was he, 33, 34? Because Beverly Hills Cop 3 bombed when he made Nutty Professor. But Eddie was a guy, a live wire, an enormous talent that people always wanted to work with. And as luck would have it, Eddie counted Steve Martin as one of his inspirations, even if it was, 10 or 15 years as far as age difference. But he loved Steve's stand-up. And some of the bonkers shit that Steve had pulled, Eddie presumably drew inspiration from. So he agreed to play what amounts to a dual role. And you go ahead and make the movie. Now, it should be pointed out, Bowfinger is a satire. It's a satire, but it's not as satirical as maybe Martin even intended, because the truth of the movie business is it is just as crazy as portrayed in this film. And this was a point in time where Robert Downey Jr. was working, but he was still going through a lot of personal turmoil. He was still hounded by the demons, which nearly ended his career and could have ended his life. For those who don't know, he's in recovery. He'll always be in recovery. The thing with Robert Downey Jr., though, no one ever questioned his talent. No one ever questioned his ability to take even small roles, underwritten, and make them memorable. So Downey Jr., despite seemingly being in trouble, he gives very vivid performances in 3 films in this era where he is not the star, but steals scenes from the stars by sheer force of will and by the fact that he is just an amazingly talented thespian. He's someone who has the magic, and we saw it in his early roles in the 80s in films like Less Than Zero, where he's just extraordinary, really. I still say that's his finest bit of film acting. But in 1997, RDJ made a movie with Robert Duvall and Kenneth Branagh called The Gingerbread Man. It's a small role, but every line reading, he's calling attention to the fact, I hope you haven't forgotten how good I am at this acting thing. And the movie succeeds in part because of his supporting performance. Then, 1998, he has a big, important, not throwaway, supporting role in the sequel to The Fugitive, which I mentioned earlier, U.S. Marshals. It's not directed by Andrew Davis, who did the first Fugitive and Chain Reaction with Keanu. The sequel to The Fugitive, U.S. Marshals, I believe was directed by Stuart Baird. I think it's directed by Stuart Baird, who had done Executive Decision and was a very well-respected editor within the industry. So RDJ in U.S. Marshals is the most memorable character in the film. The star of the movie is Tommy Lee Jones' U.S. Marshal, Samuel Gerard, the guy that he played chasing Harrison Ford up and down, left and right, inside and out in The Fugitive. We remember Robert Downey Jr.'s John Royce, FBI agent, where there's a little bit more up his sleeve than we think. So he's doing good work. And then in Bowfinger, his role is smaller than in either of the two previous films from 1997 and 98. But it's a critical role, and it is not an accident. From a certain point of view, Steve was really lucky to get somebody of Robert Downey Jr.'s caliber to play what amounts to, it's little more than a cameo. I mean, you could even call it an extended cameo. You wouldn't be wrong. He's only in a couple of scenes. But he's the point man for the studio. He's a studio executive, despite how young he is, who is very high up. And the entire plot of the film hinges upon RDJ's character of Jerry Renfro. Steve Martin's Bobby Bowfinger. He has a nice little shingle, Bowfinger International Pictures. He has worked, but he has not succeeded in Hollywood. It's very difficult to get projects off the ground, even if you have some connections, even if you have a few names you can drop, and people that will put in a phone call for you. Now it could be an email, it could be a text message. Hey, so-and-so is a friend of mine. Can you give him a meeting? Whatever it is. And this sort of, if you want to use the word nepotism, fine. If you want to use glad handing, quid pro quo, it's all true. But it doesn't necessarily make it wrong or make it bad. Other businesses do the same thing. If a person puts in a phone call for you in the accounting world, if somebody high-ranking at Citrin Cooperman or KPMG vouches for you and says, this guy is money, you're more likely to get an interview. You're more likely to get a job. So in the world of this film, Bobby Bowfinger is a big dreamer. And he has a script, which is a piece of shit. It's horrendous. But he's convinced that it's the next Citizen Kane. It's the next Citizen Kane in the guise of a science fiction action comedy type of movie that he believes is perfect for the biggest star in Hollywood, Kit Ramsey, played by Eddie Murphy, doing a great job of skewering his own image, because Eddie had a reputation, first generation Eddie, had a reputation for being a diva. He's playing an outsized version of that with the character of Kit Ramsey. So Steve Martin tells his staff that he has a meeting with the most important executive in Hollywood for this sort of project, Jerry Renfro. That's RDJ. He doesn't have a meeting with him. He goes to a restaurant when he knows Renfro is going to be there and tries to commandeer him and pitch his story. And RDJ is very sly with how he plays this. And obviously he has direction from the filmmaker, Frank Oz. But watch what RDJ does with his eyes in this particular scene. It comes early in the film. It's really good. Where he's kind of toying with Bobby Bowfinger, but he's still interested in what the guy has to say. He doesn't get angry. He doesn't say, bro, we never met. I don't know who the fuck you are. And if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to throw you. No. He listens to what he has to say. And Jerry Renfro, I believe he's kidding, but whether he's kidding or not, he makes a proposal to our intrepid Bobby Bowfinger, which Bobby Bowfinger can't possibly fulfill, but he says, look, I'm feeling crazy today. You've given me this script here, Chubby Rain, I like the title. He may be lying about that. I like the title. I'll tell you what, Bobby, if you can bring me not just this script, but if you bring me the script and Kit Ramsey, you've got yourself a go picture. Whether he's telling the truth or not, an unconnected producer with very few credits, and I think he was involved in a couple of grade Z action movies. He doesn't have any real credits. How's he going to be able to get Kit Ramsey? So he goes forth as if I just have to sign the biggest star in Hollywood, who's presumably pulling $20 million per picture. I don't have any money to offer him except about $400, but we're going to make a movie. And that's the setup. Needless to say, Kit Ramsey doesn't want to work with this guy. So Bobby Bowfinger and Bowfinger International Pictures, they put out a casting call for actors who look like Kit Ramsey. I should also point out that about a dozen years earlier, a very young, super talented, rising stand-up comic named Robert Townsend made a film on a shoestring, maxing out every credit card he could find, borrowing every foot of film he could find, calling in favors from everyone he had met in Hollywood. And Robert Townsend made a terrific satire in the ballpark of this, but Hollywood Shuffle is more in the kind of fantasy realm. But his film is called Hollywood Shuffle, and in that movie, I know that I'm quite confident that Steve Martin was echoing this deliberately. So I would assume that Steve knew Robert Townsend, was a fan of his, and loved that film Hollywood Shuffle. But in the movie Hollywood Shuffle, Robert plays a young actor, and every casting call he goes to, they're looking for an Eddie Murphy type. So in the world of Bowfinger, they're looking for a Kit Ramsey type. Who plays Kit Ramsey? Eddie Murphy. Again, these things are not accidental. This is not a coincidence. I do believe that Steve Martin was winking and nodding at Robert Townsend and how successful he was making the kind of movie, for real, Hollywood Shuffle, that Bobby Bowfinger is attempting to do in the movie Bowfinger, Chubby Rain. A screenplay written by his accountant, but it's the next Citizen Kane. Hey, listen, I love accountants. My dad was a CPA. But that's what he did. My dad didn't write sci-fi action comedy screenplays called Chubby Rain. Why is it called Chubby Rain? Because the aliens are coming to Earth in raindrops. OMG, what a great idea. Come on. But the open casting call for people who look like Kit Ramsey brings us a very upbeat and interesting and eccentric young man named Jiff, also played by Eddie Murphy. And I would say that as an unabashed Eddie Murphy fan, as I say, I really like Vampire in Brooklyn. I kind of like Beverly Hills Cop 3. I was a fan of his movies that did not quite get there, or in some cases outright bombed. Eddie Murphy's work as Jiff is as good as anything he has ever done. And he is so good playing two characters. Spoiler alert, they're brothers. The movie doesn't show us that immediately, but we can kind of surmise. I mean, he looks just like him. There was Oscar buzz for Eddie Murphy for this role. And we know that what happened with Dreamgirls, he probably was going to win supporting actor, but Norbit was so widely despised, it feels like a bunch of people just didn't vote for him. It probably cost him the award. But that's neither here nor there. Murphy is extraordinary. He is not ever someone who simply coasts on his talent, especially when he's as engaged by the material as he clearly was here and working with one of his comedy idols, which is something that I didn't know. The thing with Eddie, he surprises you. He drops names of people he studied, and he doesn't necessarily look like somebody who is deep into the research mode. He's a huge Spencer Tracy fan. I wouldn't have automatically assumed that he was a Spencer Tracy fan, but he liked the way Spencer moved through space, the timing. There are things that you just pick up on from being in the business. They're all fans too, what it comes down to. So there are certain elements of this story which mirrored and mimicked things that Steve Martin himself went through. But he has fun with it. Whatever anger he might have over certain turns in his personal life, you could say that it may spill over into the movie, but he still has fun. And Heather Graham, who was not that far removed from what most people agree is her finest film acting in Boogie Nights, she's really good in this film. She plays a character named Daisy who wants to be a star, and echoing old Hollywood of what they used to call the casting couch, she's literally willing to hook up with anybody who might further her career, even the smallest amount. And the character, you would say, well, this character is absurd, but I mean, maybe it's not that absurd. But she's really terrific in the film, and her scenes with Eddie Murphy, absolute gold. I mean, when they're on screen together, it's a riot. Ultimately, Steve is going to need Kit Ramsey. He's going to need something from the real Kit Ramsey in order to complete the film. And an actor that I adore, another guy that Generation X, especially if you're a comic book movie fan, such as myself, and so many other people in the ages, let's say 45 to 55 bracket right now, Terrence Stamp plays the leader or head of an organization, which is supposed to be the Church of Scientology. Again, there's a lot of satire in here that's as subtle as Steve Martin hitting us over the head with a hammer, but it's so obvious that it works. Subtlety wouldn't have done the trick here. So Terrence Stamp, aka General Zod from Superman 2, as great a villain performance for me as Alan Rickman in Die Hard. That's a hill I'll go down on. I love Rickman because he would be number one, Terrence Stamp as General Zod in Superman 2, we'll call it 1A. Kneel before Zod. You will bow down before me, Jor-El. You and one day your heirs. Oh, he thought he said ass. He says, you will bow down before me, Jor-El. You and one day your ass. Now he says heirs. Terrence Stamp plays the leader of this group called Mindhead, this kind of bunch of crackpots, but it's supposed to be the Church of Scientology. So they were making jokes about the Church of Scientology 25 years ago. Clearly, Steve Martin had no use for them. So Terrence Stamp kind of controls Kit Ramsey. He's manipulating him, and they kind of have blackmail material. Well, as it turns out, Mindhead does not have blackmail material on Kit Ramsey. Bobby Bowfinger does. So Terrence Stamp, who is so imperious, laying down the law to the biggest star in Hollywood, and his instincts would be to just, why would I even take a meeting with this schlock producer? He doesn't have anything to offer me. Steve Martin, though, he does. He said, listen, I don't want to release this footage of your guy, Kit Ramsey, so let's go ahead and make a movie, why don't you? And the subtleties of Terrence Stamp's face, the way that he goes from aggressively dismissal to, well, Mr. Bowfinger, I think we can do some business together. That perfect Cockney accent. Stamp, you could listen to Terrence Stamp read the phone book and it would be interesting. He just has one of those voices, the inflections, the look in his eyes. The guy is absolute gold. Needless to say, they're able to make the movie. And despite the fact that the film is not to be taken overly seriously, there are clear moments where, okay, well, this is impossible. But it is a fantasy. This is essentially a fairy tale. But there are enough realistic elements where we kind of think, okay, well, maybe in a weird way this could happen. You could make a film with nothing but stolen footage, or in the case of this, it's at least 80 to 90% stolen footage. When it's over, though, we think of just how fucking talented Eddie Murphy is. And Steve Martin is one of those people who is not afraid to cede the limelight to his co-stars. Now, even someone like Christine Baranski, who is also just great in this film, she is hilarious. But Steve knows he's playing the straight man. He is playing the conventional character. Whereas there are other movies where he's the driver, he's the engine, he's the guy getting and creating the laughs. It's not that Bobby Bowfinger isn't funny, but Eddie Murphy supplies the bulk of the humor in this film. Heather Graham supplies a lot of laughs. Christine Baranski gets a lot of laughs. But when Eddie Murphy, whenever he is on screen, Kit Ramsey is such a live wire. You never know what he's going to do, what he's going to say. But he's so earnest and even wholesome as Jiff. That's the character that we remember. And when the movie came out, there were a lot of critics that were upset because the poster seems to indicate that it's a buddy film, that it's kind of 1-2, that it's Steve Martin and Eddie Murphy. That's not really the movie. Jiff doesn't show up until you're pretty far into the film, and then he becomes the most important secondary character. But that's more on the marketing team. It can't take away anything from the film itself or the strength of the performances. And some of the special effects that we see, really fucking funny. They even get you to laugh by the special effects and some of the editing and some of the choreography. But when it's all said and done, the principals are happy. Even Robert Downey Jr.'s Jerry Renfro, mild spoiler, he's happy with how things have turned out. And it would be a number of years before RDJ was able to author his own comeback. He was in, what was the movie that he was in? Was it The Shaggy DA? Like, he was doing projects because he wanted to stay busy and keep working, but he was making movies that were so far beneath his talent level. And I know he did Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. Was it with Val? I think it was with Val Kilmer. But the key film for RDJ was Zodiac, which started filming like six and a half years after Bowfinger. And what he showed there was that he was back. He was ready to work. And let's go. Let's make some great movies. And then he was cast in Iron Man on the strength of what he did in Zodiac, and presumably all of the people involved with that production saying, he's focused, he's in recovery, he's good. He'll give you the best that he's got, which is considerable. I always wish that they had made a sequel to Bowfinger, but the film just didn't do that well at the box office. $55+ million budget, and worldwide it didn't even crack 100. It's the sort of gross that if the film had had a limited budget of 15 to 20, you'd say, sure, let's fire up a sequel. But I would have been interested in seeing it. There wasn't any chatter for it. And Eddie Murphy, unfortunately, did not get a Best Supporting Actor nomination for just sensational work as Kit Ramsey and Jiff Ramsey. Bowfinger, released on this day, 1999. Directed by Frank Oz, that's Miss Piggy and Yoda, for those who don't know, the voice of Miss Piggy and Yoda, very fine filmmaker. Directed by Frank Oz, and starring Steve Martin, Eddie Murphy, Christine Baranski, Heather Graham, Terrence Stamp, Jamie Kennedy in a very interesting role, and a fire Robert Downey Jr. This has been episode 276 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I want to thank you all for spending some of your Tuesday morning here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.